I need to tell you about the morning I stopped believing the forest was empty. The snow that day was so fresh it squeaked beneath my boots. That particular sound that only comes when the cold bites deep enough to harden each crystal. I was 3 miles into my patrol route when I saw the red, a spreading darkness against all that white purity that made my breath catch before my mind could process what I was seeing. The body lay crumpled like discarded clothing, steam still rising from exposed tissue where the head should have been. But it was what surrounded him that made my knees weaken. The footprints were massive, each one sunk 8 inches deep into powder that barely held my own. Wait. They circled the body in a careful pattern, deliberate and measured, then disappeared into the tree line, where the cedars grew so thick that daylight became suggestion. I've tracked black bears, followed wolf packs, documented every creature that calls these woods home. These prints belonged to nothing in my field guides. I stood there as my radio crackled with static, knowing I should call this in, knowing I should move. But something kept me frozen, staring at those impossible tracks, feeling for the first time in my career that the forest was staring back, that it had always been watching, waiting for us to finally see. My grandmother used to sit by the wood stove on winter nights, her weathered hands moving through the air like she was weaving the stories themselves into being. She told me about the keeper, a figure that walked the boundary between our world and the wild places we'd forgotten how to honor. Her voice would drop to a whisper when she described how it stood taller than any man, how it moved through the forest without sound, how it remembered every promise our ancestors made to the land. I was 7 years old, pressed against her side, believing every word with the certainty that only children possess. Those stories faded as I grew older, buried beneath biology courses and forestry training, dismissed as folklore meant to keep kids from wandering too far alone. I learned scientific names for everything that lived in these woods, measured their territories, tracked their migration patterns. Knowledge became my armor against the unknown, each Latin classification a nail in the coffin of childish wonder. But standing there in the snow, looking at those impossible prints, I felt that armor crack and fall away like ice from a thawing branch. My grandmother had described the footprints exactly, down to the way the toes splayed wide to distribute weight, the depth that spoke of something far heavier than its grace suggested. She said the keeper only revealed itself when the balance tipped, when someone took what was never meant to leave. Her eyes would grow distant then, as if she could see across years and generations to older betrayals, older reckonings. I'd asked her once if she'd ever seen it herself, and she'd only smiled sadly and touched my cheek with fingers that smelled of sage. Now her words returned with the weight of prophecy, each memory sharp as broken glass. The way she'd insisted these weren't just stories but warnings, responsibilities passed down through bloodlines that still remembered. How she'd made me promise to listen to the forest, to respect what I couldn't understand. I stood there in the cold, my grandmother 5 years dead, finally understanding that she'd been preparing me for this moment. The forest had never been empty. I'd just forgotten how to see what was always there. The hiker's name was Michael Reeves, and his tent yielded a life's obsession laid bare in worn notebooks and blurred photographs. Page after page documented years of weekend expeditions, each entry more desperate than the last, tracking supposed Sasquatch territories with the fervor of religious devotion. But the final week told a different story, his handwriting degrading from careful block letters to frantic scrawls that bled across margins. He'd felt eyes on him constantly, heard breathing that matched his own rhythm from somewhere in the darkness, found his equipment moved in patterns he couldn't explain. The last entry was dated 2 days before we found him, just 3 words repeated down the entire page. It knows, it knows, it knows. Beneath that, a crude map marking a location he called the Source, a clearing he'd been excavating against every posted warning and treaty boundary. My hands trembled, holding those pages, understanding dawning like cold water down my spine. This wasn't documentation anymore. It was confession, the chronicle of a man who'd convinced himself that discovery justified desecration. His camera's memory card showed the progression, images of him carefully removing artifacts from disturbed earth, holding up carved bones and ancient tools, like trophies. But the final photos captured something else entirely, frames and frames of darkness punctuated by 2 points of reflected light, always at the same height, always watching. In the last image, those lights had moved closer, and you could see the shape around them, massive shoulders blocking out the stars. I couldn't stop thinking about his expression when we'd found him. How peaceful it had looked despite everything, as if in that final moment he'd finally understood what he'd been chasing. The forest had answered his obsession, just not with the validation he'd expected. The dreams began the night I closed Michael's final journal, arriving with the weight of inherited memory rather than imagination. I walked through forests I'd patrolled 1,000 times, yet transformed by moonlight into cathedral spaces where my breath hung like incense and the snow sang beneath my boots. Always ahead, those massive prints pressed deep into pristine white, each step deliberate as prayer, and I followed with a certainty that felt older than thought itself. The humming rose from everywhere and nowhere, a sound felt in bone before ear, carrying wordless stories of seasons beyond counting and responsibilities that predated borders drawn on maps. Sometimes I'd stop walking and sense the presence just beyond vision, patient as stone, waiting for understanding to catch up. With instinct, in those pauses between heartbeats, I felt what Michael must have felt, except where he'd chased validation, I was being invited to witness. Morning always came too quickly, pulling me back to waking life, but the dreams left residue like morning frost on windows. I'd find myself humming that same deep melody while making coffee, my hands moving in patterns I didn't recognize, arranging objects on my desk in configurations that somehow felt necessary and correct. The boundary between sleeping and waking grew thin as tissue paper, and I understood this was communication beyond language, a teaching transmitted through symbol and sensation. The creature was showing me what it guarded, why it walked, the covenant it kept when all others had forgotten. The elder arrived on the third morning after the dreams began, walking into the ranger station without knocking, snow melting from his worn boots onto linoleum that suddenly felt disrespectfully modern. He carried the scent of cedar and wood smoke, his eyes holding that particular clarity of those who've spent lifetimes reading what forests write in their own language. I hadn't called anyone, yet he sat across from my desk as if summoned by something neither of us could name, but both recognized. "Your grandmother was Mary Whitecrow," he said, not asking, and my breath caught because I'd never mentioned her to anyone here. Never spoke of the stories she'd braided into my childhood like sweetgrass. She knew the old ways, the agreements made when this land was young and listening. His weathered hands folded together, patient and terrible. The guardian walks when sacred ground is violated, when boundary stones are crossed by those who've forgotten why they were placed. He described the creature not as myth, but as consequence, an enforcer of oaths my ancestors had sworn and his people had witnessed, a keeper of balance that demanded physical price for spiritual transgression. The heads weren't trophies, but warnings, he explained, messages written in the only language that ignorance might finally comprehend. My grandmother had known this, had tried to teach me reverence disguised as bedtime stories, planting seeds for understanding I was only now desperate enough to water. "It will come for you next," he said softly, "not to harm, but to see if you remember what she tried to teach you." The hiker's campsite remained untouched by investigation, cordoned by yellow tape that fluttered like cowardly flags against what had happened here. I returned alone with the elder's words still burning in my chest, searching not for evidence, but for desecration, for the wound my grandmother's stories had taught me to recognize. Behind his tent, barely concealed by displaced snow, I found The excavation, a careful, methodical violation, where frozen earth had been removed in numbered bags, catalogued with the arrogance of those who believe documentation justifies theft. The hole gaped like a mouth, screaming silently into winter sky. His field notes lay scattered in the tent, meticulous records of grave goods removed over 3 weeks, of secret nocturnal digging, beadwork, ceremonial pipes, fragments of birchbark scrolls whose words he couldn't read but photographed anyway, treating sacred text like curious data. He'd written about the items with collector's enthusiasm, pricing estimates and museum contacts, never once considering these objects were placed by hands that loved. By grief that consecrated, by agreements between the living and dead he'd shattered with his trowel. The final entry simply read, "It knows what I've done." I knelt at the excavation's edge and felt my grandmother's stories crystallize into terrible comprehension. This wasn't murder but response, not violence but the enforcement of laws older than the nation that had drawn park boundaries over indigenous memory. The guardian hadn't killed out of rage but necessity, removing the head that conceived theft, the hands that enacted it. The artifacts were still in his truck, waiting to become his legacy instead of remaining where love had buried them. I loaded the artifacts into my pack at dusk, their weight somehow heavier than physics allowed, and followed the footprints into territory where my radio crackled into useless static. The forest thickened around me until the trail became a tunnel of ancient pine, each step forward feeling like walking backward through time itself. My breath clouded white in air that had grown suddenly, impossibly colder, and I knew with absolute certainty I was no longer alone. The humming from my dreams rose from the ground beneath my boots, a sound like sorrow given voice. It stood between 2 massive cedars, 15 feet of living contradiction that my mind struggled to process and accept. Not the movie monster I'd half expected, but something far more terrible in its obvious intelligence, its deliberate stillness that communicated awareness and judgment. Its eyes caught moonlight and reflected centuries, watching me with recognition that pierced straight through my ranger uniform to the child who'd listened to grandmother's warnings. I understood then that it had always known I would come, that this moment had been waiting since the hiker's first shovel broke sacred ground. I lowered myself to my knees in snow that soaked through immediately, wordlessly offering the pack forward with trembling hands. The creature moved with impossible silence for something so massive, each step a careful negotiation with earth that knew its weight. When it reached toward me, I saw hands that could crush, but chose gentleness, taking the artifacts with reverence that shamed every museum I'd ever visited. It touched my forehead with one finger, and I felt the forest's memory flood through me. Every broken promise, every violated grave, every boundary crossed by those who'd forgotten that. Forgetting has consequences. The vision wasn't mine, but became mine. Generations of stewards who'd held this boundary before forgetting turned to neglect. I saw the creature not as monster, but as the last keeper of promises our ancestors made when they first walked these lands. It had witnessed every violation with those ancient eyes, carrying the accumulated weight of our collective amnesia. This wasn't punishment but consequence, the price of treating sacred ground like mere real estate. Tears froze on my cheeks as understanding crashed through me like revelation and grief combined. The hiker hadn't been murdered but had triggered something older than law, a covenant written in bone and earth. The creature's sadness wasn't for itself, but for us, for how thoroughly we'd forgotten that some doors shouldn't open. I felt the exhaustion radiating from it, centuries of standing guard while the world pretended it didn't exist. When it withdrew its hand, I gasped as though surfacing from deep water, my own memories flooding back, but transformed. Every careless footstep off trail, every littered campsite, every ignored warning sign now carried different meaning. The creature stepped backward into shadow, and I understood it was giving me choice, to carry this knowledge forward or join those who'd chosen comfortable blindness. It vanished between heartbeats, leaving only the humming that faded like a question waiting for answer. I knelt in snow that had witnessed everything, forever changed by touch that taught what words never could. I returned at first light, carrying the artifacts in a canvas bag that felt heavier than its physical weight. The burial site lay beneath a fresh blanket of snow, unmarked, except for the scar where earth had been violated. My hands trembled as I replaced each item with whispered apologies I'd learned from the elder, words in a language my grandmother had tried to teach me before I stopped listening. The forest held its breath around me, waiting to see if understanding had truly taken root. As I placed the final piece, the oppressive heaviness that had saturated these woods for weeks suddenly lifted like morning fog. Birds began calling again after their long silence, and sunlight broke through clouds that had lingered grey and suffocating. That's when I saw it. The hiker's head resting on a flat stone, as though carefully positioned, his expression peaceful in a way death rarely grants. No violence marked him now, only the solemn finality of boundaries enforced. I understood then what the creature had tried to show me through our wordless communion. This wasn't about vengeance, but restoration, not punishment, but the inevitable consequence of forgetting that respect must be more than word. The hiker had become an unwilling teacher, his fate a message written for those still capable of reading it. I buried him properly with the honor his obsession had blinded him from offering others. Walking back through snow that crunched beneath my boots, I felt the weight of stewardship settle onto my shoulders. The enormous footprints beside my own path seemed almost companionable now, a reminder that I no longer walked these boundaries alone. Some guardians carry badges, while others carry the memory of oaths older than nations. I finally understood which mattered more. The official report classified it as an animal attack by unknown predator, case closed due to insufficient evidence. My superiors accepted my account with relieved gratitude, eager to file away something that defied explanation. But I carry the truth in the careful way I now walk these trails, in how I've learned to read the forest's moods like my grandmother once did. The boundary between worlds feels thinner now, and I've become its student rather than its master. Sometimes during winter patrols, I find those massive prints pressed deep in fresh snow, always near places where visitors have strayed too close to forgotten sacred ground. They disappear within yards, melting impossibly fast, or simply ending as though their maker stepped from earth into air. I've stopped trying to photograph them, understanding finally that some truths lose their power when we try to capture them. The mystery itself is the message. Other rangers have noticed the change in me, how I redirect hikers from certain areas with an authority that brooks no argument, how I've begun learning the old language from the elder who visits monthly now. They think grief made me superstitious after finding that body. Let them think it. The forest knows different, and that's the only opinion that carries weight on land, older than the cities we've built beside it. On the coldest nights, I still hear that sorrowful humming rising from deep places, and instead of fear, I feel kinship. We're both guardians now, walking parallel, in paths through snow and shadow. Some boundaries can't be marked on any map, but they're no less real for their invisibility. The footprints beside mine prove that some promises outlast everything we thought permanent. What boundaries in your own life have you forgotten to respect? Subscribe to hear more stories where the forgotten still remembers.